The first 1,000 days of human life are a remarkable window. A baby's environment and interaction with caregivers doesn't just shape that baby's brain, it literally creates the brain. In the time that it takes to drink a cup of coffee, a baby's brain forms thousands, hundreds of thousands of neural connections. More than 80% of the brain's white matter is built. The brain literally doubles in size. Now picture a 40-year-old slumped in the doctor's office. His blood pressure is high. He's struggling with stress. He finds relationships harder than he expected. Here's the unsettling question. What if some of that story began before he could even walk or speak? Because by age 2, his brain had already formed the majority of its core neural circuits. Stress response systems were already in place. Emotional regulation and learning pathways were already in place. Research is showing us that those early systems do not disappear. We focus so much on school, but the blueprint for school readiness, and indeed life readiness, is being laid long before that first day of kindergarten. Of course, nutrition during this time is critically important, but the landscape of consciousness and meaning-making grows in response to cuddling and comforting and playfulness.
This little piggy went to market. This little
and
piggy
touch and
stayed
laughter.
But this little piggy went wee all the way home.
The quality of care in the first 1,000 days predicts so much of who this baby will become. How is this little human being socialized? How do other humans around it respond when it cries out in hunger or distress? Is there back and forth interaction that is meaningful? Those patterns will show up in the form of focus and curiosity and executive functioning. The ability to sit still, to follow directions, to handle frustration is being shaped long before a child ever sees a pencil. We are the teaching species. Actually, let's turn that idea on its head. We are the learning species. From the moment of birth, we are wired to absorb the world. Patterns, faces, voices, cause and effect. And our cognition is tied to our emotions. Today's episode is special. We are proud to welcome children's author and veteran teacher Geeta Varadarajan to the Teaching Species team. Geeta interviews Casey Lew-Williams, who is the psychology chair at Princeton University, and he also runs their baby lab. My favorite bit is where Geeta gets Casey to respond not just as a scientist and a researcher, but also as a father of 2 young sons. Fun fact, she actually taught both those sons, so she knows Casey as a parent first and as a scientist later.
Okay, so Casey, welcome to the Teaching Species podcast.
It's so great you guys are doing this. This is so lovely.
I was thinking about when you invited me so graciously to come to your baby lab at Princeton University. It was the summer, I think, of 2021. Dane, your younger son, had just finished his 4th grade year in my classroom at Riverside. And as I walked into your space, there was a sense of cozy nursery and cutting-edge laboratory. That's how I would describe it.
That is a beautiful description. That's what we're aiming for. We are a unique kind of science. We are trying to do serious work about the beginnings of learning in life, but we also know that we're a field that is full of playfulness. And we're equal parts basic science and applied science, almost by definition. Whenever you do research about child development, it's relevant to the real world in some capacity. Perhaps it's a few steps away from becoming something, more applied, and educators or parents or clinicians or policymakers have to take note of it. But we try to do work that both helps us understand theories of learning or development or growth or change, but also try to give every kid a fair chance in life. So I think our space reflects that because we have these bright walls. We want kids to feel comfortable and welcomed, that they get to interact with interesting undergraduates and graduate students and postdocs and have fun. But at the same time, we get to learn something very fundamental, which is about the mechanisms of human learning, cognition, and sociality and the brain.
Hmm. So, my first question really is about the first 1,000 days of a child's life. What educators and caregivers need to pay attention to?
Well, the first 1,000 days are, one might argue, the most important. This is when the brain is changing the most, when the child is adapting to their local environment, and they are surrounded by people and objects and events. It's a it's a laundry list, right? Infinite list, really. There are so many predictors of children's later outcomes. Okay, so there are basics like safety and security and nutrition, but there's much more. And I think something very central that developmental science has converged on is the importance of time with children, engagement with children, and playfulness with children during these 3 years. And it's not just these 3 years. We can define it as every early year counts, right? Responding to your child and spending the time to take an interest in them. Science converges to show that this is a key ingredient of all sorts of outcomes. So, you know, there are so many factors involved in a child's early experiences. They change over time, and critically, they vary across children. That's an obvious point about culture, I think. But at least, I'll say locally here in the United States in particular, there's great disparity depending on what socioeconomic strata you're in. So, I mean, income inequality in this country is something very important to me. It's, as I believe a humor article put it, the eighth wonder of the world, right? Because it really is that much of a heavyweight on child development in the first 1,000 days. And not every kid is given a fair chance during these first 1,000 days. So, what can we as a society do to remedy this? Um, we can try to create good things like a child having supportive caregivers wherever they look, having community centers like a YMCA or a church, right, that helps children feel a sense of community. And these are known predictors of helping kids uh, establish resilience, even if they're facing difficult circumstances in these first 1,000 days. So that's my way of saying there are many influences, but we should never ignore the variability across children and that there's no one size fits all way of describing the importance of those first years.
Right. So, when you talk about variability across children, when do we start to see the uniqueness of each baby?
Ooh, I love that. Well, I mean, there's some basic facts here to go into genetics, I guess. So, um, I mean, each child is so unique, and that's by definition from birth, right?
Mm.
So, when an egg is fertilized by a sperm, right? The pairs of chromosomes of the two parents are essentially, in simplest terms, shuffled up, right? They're recombined. And each parent donates what will become, the new pair for each child. And this shuffling, this recombination, results in an unfathomably large numbers of uniqueness. Okay, so I actually taught this just about a month ago, so I'm going to be roughly correct with my numbers here, but there are upward of 15 to 20 trillion possible combinations
Wow.
of offspring of two parents, of any two parents.
Mm.
Okay. And that's actually an underestimate because there's this process called crossover. Actually, subparts of chromosomes can also be exchanged. And this magnifies the number to this ridiculous extent. It's something like 300 septillion possible combinations
Wow.
of chromosomes for every pair of people. So when you put it that way, right, 300 septillion possible combinations for any two parents, uniqueness abounds. Uniqueness
Mhm.
abounds, right? And this essentially means that this initial cell, right, the zygote, is essentially infinitely variable. Then you put a kid with their own internal cognition and learning capacities out into the vast complexity of their own environment, right? Their household, their social network, their objects around them, right? Their experiences across timescales, right? From short to very long. And you see the sort of infinite potential for uniqueness. And I think this manifests in not only the unique appearance of every single person in this world, right? But also the unique combination of experiences and behaviors associated with each one. So in that sense, every baby is absurdly unique.
right? And so, what's the role of nature versus nurture? I know that they are so unique because of the very fact of the DNA and the septillion combinations of things that could happen. But what's the role of nurture here?
So this is, one of the most debated topics in perhaps all of the history of scholarship. So
Mhm.
there's no easy answer. But at this point, what's very safe to say is it's a bit of a false dichotomy because not only are these two factors, nature and nurture, in interaction all the time, right? But they are just hard to separate. Anything you try to describe as nurture can't successfully be separated from nature.
Yeah, so interesting. And the role of adults, and you did talk about, how we respond to babies in those first 1,000 days is so important as adults. And there seems to be some kind of innate way in which adults respond to, I mean, like parents and caregivers respond to babies. I think they call it motherese, the way they communicate with babies.
Before we listen to Casey's response to Geeta's question, I want you to picture that person who in regular life, they're all angles and efficiency and, their face has never once accidentally smiled. But then you put a baby in front of them and something short circuits. Their voice jumps an octave. Their vocabulary collapses into, who is this? Look at those cheeks. Goo goo gaga. Yes, you are. Yes, you are. Right? That's the same person who 10 minutes earlier corrected your grammar and asked for bullet points. At the sight of a baby, suddenly their eyebrows start doing acrobatics. And the baby, of course, is delighted. It's like the baby in under 5 seconds has pulled this person out of adulthood and into our oldest human language.
No,
Yeah.
I love this question. You're actually hitting at something that is at the core of my research program. Folks in my lab are focused on, like I am, on the early development of communication and language. I think the most, interesting topic out there is how parents speak to their kids, to their babies. It's known
Mm.
as motherese. It's called infant-directed speech. It's called child-directed speech. It's called baby talk. It sort of
Mm.
depends, who's talking to you. But this is a fascinating phenomenon to me. And I think for many years, it was thought of as a silly thing, right, that parents do. And that is the opposite of the truth, right? It is not a silly thing. It is actually a serious topic of inquiry and a serious influence on the child. And it's a beautiful speech register, right? We use more variable pitch. We use slightly higher pitch.
Hi. Yes.
We use shorter sentences. We put in more pauses.
Talk to Mama.
We use more repetition. We actually even exaggerate the difference between vowels a little bit more when we use this speech register as well. So there's all these micro features of it that nobody's thinking about. It's just
Mm.
what we do. So, infant-directed speech, as I'll refer to it here, has all sorts of benefits. It gets infants' attention. It helps them distinguish sounds. It conveys emotion and meaning before they know the words themselves.
Where's my happy girl? There she is.
It's even known to boost brain development in key language areas. And I'm not going to call it universal, but I will say it exists, it seems, in most languages and cultures, but to very different extents and in very different ways. But it's safe to call it widespread and highly variable. And importantly, it's actually just one way that parents accommodate their young little listener. It's not just speech. We actually do infant-directed communicative signals in many ways,
Mhm.
including gestures, facial expressions of emotion, social touch, the way that we touch or hold infants,
Mhm.
right, is different. And even the way that we perform actions. We exaggerate actions when we're engaging in a pedagogical version of them, right? So there's all these ways that caregivers implicitly cater to this somewhat relatively ignorant listener,
Mhm.
right, compared to the adults in their lives. And these accommodations, especially speech, are known to have great benefits for information processing and for learning things that are important, like vocabulary. But critically, I want to point out differences across cultures. So there's some recent work on, for example, babies in Bolivia from a Quechua community in Bolivia,
Mhm.
and speech to infants, directly to infants, is not as common there. And there's actually a lot more speech from peers and siblings, which is really an interesting difference compared to the, culture that I was raised in North America. Um, but what's interesting is when you do these accommodations, when you use infant-directed speech, it has the same benefits, these positive effects on the child's learning when it does happen, even in communities where this does not occur as much. For example, parents are wearing their babies on their backs and they're going about their days as normal, and they may not be directly speaking to the child, but the child is overhearing speech all day long, right? In combination with some speech at them. So it's just interesting to think about the variation across cultures and communities and how we use language with kids, how we do this in an embodied way using all these different communicative signals. And I think there might be a bit of an art to this that seems to predict good things for the child later.
So, I mean, switching gears a little bit
Yeah.
about, how kids learn multiple languages. And we've heard that they can learn many, many languages at the same time. How does that happen?
The best answer I can give is that it depends on exposure to each language. Which language you're hearing, the age of exposure to that language, the infant-directed speech qualities of exposure to each language, the amount and quality, right? Or the affect and emotionality of those using the languages. Okay. So these are what makes or breaks, quote unquote, successful bilingualism. And critically, bilingualism is a range. It's not a dichotomy. You can have everything from no awareness of two languages whatsoever, all the way up to fluency in two or more languages. But there are all sorts of myths out there that parents believe. We take myths like learning a new language can cause language delays. That is not true. Knowing another language can make it harder to learn English
Hmm.
in the US context. That is not true. Or that mixing languages together within and across sentences is a sign of confusion or is not good for the kid. That is not true.
Hmm.
Um, that parents should separate languages by speaker. This is a very common thing, right? One parent speaks Mandarin, the other one speaks English, and that's the way to promote successful bilingualism. That is not necessarily a good strategy for successful bilingualism. That's just a thing that was made up at some point, and there's not really been a good test of it. There's, of course, the big issue of whether bilingualism makes you smarter. And this is something that is often used to promote bilingual education in the US. And I think the answer to that is it's not necessarily the case, except that many things make you smarter. Things we've talked about today make you smarter, right? Exercise makes you smarter. Music, nutrition, having responsive caregivers who play with you a lot, or sleeping a lot, or reading books, right? These are all things that make you smarter. Bilingualism is just one of many, and it is not unique in that way. So it's important to me to help dispel some of these myths so that parents can relax a little bit and use two languages in the way that matches their environment and their goals. And then in most cases, kids are fine. You can't just teach your kid a few number words in, Spanish and expect them to be fluent in Spanish. That's not how it works, right? They have to get meaningful exposure in some above some threshold of quantity. But there's really no recipe for success, and parents should just be themselves and enjoy using language in a way that their kid will enjoy too. And beyond this idea that bilingualism makes you smarter, there's just so many other benefits of bilingualism. Like it's great for social connection, and you get to read in two languages. Your perspective taking skills, right, are good. You have better family relations when you're bilingual, if you can speak both languages with your grandparents, for example, and maybe there are career advantages. If anything, you get to be a citizen of the world compared to those who only know one language in a different way. So, um, yeah, these are some of the issues I care about with bilingualism.
How much has being a parent influenced your work? Because I know as a teacher, I'm constantly thinking about my own sons and how they would react to a situation, and I bring that into my teaching. So, how has your being a dad to two sons influenced your work? Have you observed your own children as babies in your work?
I didn't mix parenting and work at all, really, to
Wow.
be honest.
Okay.
This was motivated by not wanting to be a stereotype of a developmental scientist.
Right.
I didn't want my kids to grow up thinking like, I was just a participant in a big study, because that's not at all been the case.
Yeah.
But this actually felt like a very organic separation to me because I was very tired all the time as a parent and as a professor. And I didn't have the energy to mix the two very well, to be honest. So I didn't say like, oh, here's the thing I learned at work. I'm gonna go try it with my kids. But okay, but to some extent, I'm exaggerating a bit too much here because there were lessons for my field that factored into my parenting for sure. So that was one direction of influence, right? Where I came away from my early work in this field all the way up to now with the belief in the importance of time together and playfulness.
Yeah.
And so I certainly deployed that in my own parenting. And I think being a parent and being a dad has influenced my thinking about child development in ways, of course, too. So, I mean, getting back to our conversation earlier, each child is beautiful and unique. And also, you work as a parent with what you get. Uh, I don't mean that as some, pleasantry. It's just a reality. Children are different, and they're different from their parents. And you work with that. I am somewhat successful as a parent. I am somewhat of a failure as a parent.
Of all that Casey shared during this interview, this felt like the defining moment where he confessed to not being perfect as a parent. Because there is no such thing as the perfect parent, not even when you're a professor of the field. There is no formula to foolproof the first 1,000 days or any subsequent stage of child rearing. Of all the studies that have come out of Princeton's Baby Lab, my favorite is one that showed that when an adult and a baby play face to face, when they share eye contact and a song or toy or a book, their brains actually synchronize. That is, their brain activity literally rises and falls together, like when dancers mirror and support and anticipate each other's moves. Isn't that so cool? What's even more interesting, the strongest coupling occurred in the prefrontal cortex, which previously was thought to be quite underdeveloped during infancy. And by the way, that neural synchrony only showed up when there was a real interaction. And that tells us that babies are not just passive recipients. The brain activity showed that they could even lead the interaction by guiding where the adult's attention went. Yeah, I just shudder to think of screens or machines taking over that kind of bonding time between a baby and a caregiver. Every day, in tiny ways, children ask, "Do you see me? Do I matter?" How we respond shapes so much. A very special thank you to Casey Lew-Williams and to the incredible work being done at Princeton's Baby Lab. If you enjoyed this episode, please know that this show is not sponsored. We make this podcast because we believe these conversations matter. So, if an episode makes you think or see something differently, please share it with someone you care about.